Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing on the design of weapons for video games, which in turn is a part of a suite of videos that I'm doing on game design issues, which in turn is part of my channel on game development subjects. And in this, I want to talk about some design thoughts as pertains to weapons in video games. Some of this stuff is things that you may think is completely obvious, that are things that you need to be considering when you're getting involved in the design of weapons for games. And as always in these videos, I'm assuming that you're a person who wants to learn something about game design, maybe practicing game design, maybe you aspire to be a game designer for your job, or maybe you just want to do some for fun and want to find out what some good practice is being thought of. Anyway, let's get into these thoughts. So the first one is that weapons are about feelings, which seems a bit of an odd thing to say in some ways, because weapons are obviously about doing damage to your opponents. But there's quite a lot of emotions that can be connected with the weapons, both in real life and in games. So I think it's very important that you consider how the player perceives these things. So what am I going on about? What do I mean when I'm claiming that weapons and feelings are connected? Well, weapons give power. So if a player has a weapon, they feel powerful. And the more powerful the weapon, the more personal power they feel. And so as a designer, you need to be thinking about that perception of power that the player has. Now, some of that will come through from the numbers and the stats, and we'll talk about that sort of thing. But also it comes about with the appearance of the weapon and the special effects surrounding the use of the weapon. Weapons are personal, and players can get very attached to weapons that they've used for a long time in games. They're personal possessions, and in real life, again, people can get very attached to their weapons. And in fantasy stories, you have the concept of a named sword, which is something that's of immense significance to the person who's got it. Weapons are safe. A bit of an odd thing to say, but there is this perception that one way of being safe is to carry a weapon, and it's certainly true in video games that if you're wandering around without a weapon, then you've got a problem. If you've got things that are going to attack you, you may be able to do a small amount of damage with your bare hands, but usually you need some kind of weapon in order to face the world around you. In the real world, things could be somewhat different, and I don't really want to get too philosophical because this is about game design after all. But I have come across advice for the real world, which is the easiest way not to get shot is to not carry a gun, for example. But when it comes to games, certainly there's this thought of safety. Weapons are reliable, although they're not always in games, but a weapon is something that you can put your trust in, and it can be relied on to get you out of trouble. So some games have the concept of unreliable weapons. Minecraft has weapons where it has a durability, and at some point it'll run out. You can watch very carefully on the durability bar when that's going to happen, so it doesn't take you by surprise. Other games have gone down the route of having, for example, guns that occasionally jam, or technological weapons that backfire in some way, have a chance to. And I think this is obviously a game design decision that you make, but I think if you're making that kind of decision, it's good to be aware that what you're breaking more than just the fact that the player can use this weapon and predict the fact that it's going to do a certain amount of damage. You're also breaking this concept of reliability that comes with weapons. So that's some thoughts about the feelings. Let's move on quickly. We'll talk about iconic weapons then for a little while. I don't want to do a lot of this, but it is possible to have weapons in games that achieve an iconic status, or have previously achieved an iconic status. What do I mean by this? Well, let's have a couple of examples. Here we've got the Buster Sword from Final Fantasy. And that's iconic just in the first place because it's so easy to spot and so unusual in its appearance. It's huge. And the BFG from Doom, and this is from the 2016 remaking. And this was a gun that gave a great feeling of power when you got it. And I'm old enough to have played Doom back in the original at the time when it was released, and the BFG was an awesome weapon in the correct sense of the word. It's great. And here's another one, which is an interesting thing, which is that this is from Tomb Raider 3, and these are the Desert Eagles. And I understand that Desert Eagle is a real-life gun. I was living with a flatmate at the time when I was playing Tomb Raider games in the early days, and every time I was playing and pulled out the Desert Eagles, he would say, "Desert Eagles!" And so he was a gun enthusiast. And for him, there was a resonance from the real-life gun and the fact that there was a replica of this gun done with a certain amount of a certain amount of homage to the real life guns in the game. So it's possible to use iconic weapons from real life, and I haven't got a picture of it, but one of the most iconic weapons from fiction and fantasy, of course, is the lightsaber from Star Wars. And if you're doing a Star Wars game, of course you want to be using lightsabers. So what I really want to say is to draw your awareness to the fact that there are some IP settings that have already existing iconic weapons, but it's possible to create your own icons if you make a really good weapon. Okay, so moving on. This, I think, is possibly the most obvious thing that I'm going to say in this video, which is design your weapons to match the tone of the game. I'm just going to give 4 quick examples of tone. Here's Worms franchise, and it's a silly game, so you are very open to cartoony and silly weapons and things like exploding sheep. This is kind of the other end of the seriousness spectrum with Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and you're looking at some very serious replication and simulation of real-world weapons. You've got fantasy settings where that obviously has an impact on your design of weapons, not just visually, but also on how they work and what you can do with them. And historical settings will obviously have constraints on the weapons that you may be using. It gives you opportunities to use some iconic weapons like the musket here, and but again, it kind of depends on your setting. If you're mixing fantasy with history, then there are all sorts of things that you can do. But if you want to be faithful to the historical setting, then that will steer you very strongly in your setting. There obviously are more types of setting out there. There's sci-fi, and I haven't looked at that, and there's all sorts of things that could steer the design of your weapons, but it's the really obvious thing to say, which is your weapons need to match your genre, your style of your game, and your setting. Okay, so I want to move on to thinking about weapon attributes. So when you have a weapon, obviously you might have it in your hand or however it's used in a game, and it's only any use if it actually has some some numbers or attributes attached to it that will allow it to be used in combat. So I'm going to quickly go through what I think are the most likely attributes you might have for weapons. So the first few I think you probably have in most, if not all, games for weapons, and then a few that I would think of as more optional things that you might bring in. So availability is a thing. Of course, how can the player get hold of the weapon? Is it do they only get it after a certain point? You can do unlocking weapons as you go along, and I'm going to do a video about that later in the series. The use of weapons. So I guess when we start thinking about weapons, we tend to think about weapons that are carried around by the player, and then they're wielded by the player, and maybe they use one or two hands. So if you're using a one-handed weapon, it may be possible to have something in the other hand, maybe a second weapon, if or a shield. But if you're using a two-handed weapon, obviously, unless you have some kind of fantasy race or modification for humans such that they have more than two arms, then you're out of arms, and so potentially you're out of weapons. You can't add more weapons to the mix. But there are other ways of doing weapons. So you can have fixed position weapons, weapons that have been created as part of an installation. And another major category, I think, is weapons that are mounted on a vehicle. And that doesn't just mean, so immediately what that brings to mind for me is a machine gun mounted on the back of a Jeep as you're driving along through maybe jungle terrain, and you've got one person driving and one person shooting. And of course, that is something you can do. But it also includes things like space combat, where you've got a spaceship and you've got built-in weapons to that, projectile weapons, energy weapons, all sorts of things you might have. So anything where you're driving a vehicle as either part or all of your game, and you've got combat, there may be some mounted weapons involved. Moving on, a fairly obvious attribute is something to do with damage or how powerful the weapon is, or what sort of effect it has on the enemy. Possibly something to do with accuracy. This isn't always something that comes into play, and that applies for both melee weapons and for ranged weapons, but is even more likely to be the case when you have ranged weapons, that you might have some kind of accuracy stat or calculation. So let me give a quick example. I will talk more about guns in a video that's coming up, but the difference between a sniper rifle and a shotgun is very obvious, and there are several differences, but one of the differences is accuracy. And with a sniper rifle, you get a great deal of accuracy over quite a long distance, whereas a shotgun has this kind of scatter effect, and so your accuracy is much lower. And then the third thing that ties together with those other two is the speed, or how long the time is taken to use it, or some potential cooldown time. So even with machine guns, when you press down and hold to continuously shoot, actually there is a period of time, it'd be presumably a very short period of time between individual shots. And unless your weapon is a continuous weapon, like some kind of laser beam weapon, there almost always is some kind of time attributes that comes into play here. That could be literally the time that you can have between shots. It can be the amount of time it takes to do the animation to do a shot, or it could be styled to the player as a cooldown, so that you can't shoot it again or use it again within a certain amount of time. But I think pretty much all weapons have some kind of aspect of time involved to stop players from being able to just spam very, very fast on a button and do very fast amounts of damage. And those three things that we've been talking about combined, so damage and time, and to some extent accuracy, combined to give you the concept of DPS, which is damage per second. And you may have come across this as a rating for weapons in forums. and directly quoted in games as well, which is the way to combine the efficiency or the efficacy of two weapons against each other often comes down to looking at the DPS that you can get out of that weapon. So not actually the damage of an individual shot or strike. Even melee weapons, there's probably some concept of the reach of the weapon. So how close do you have to be to an enemy to be able to use the weapon effectually? So if the classic melee weapon, which is a sword, if you've got a real space game, so you're not playing in a kind of grid situation, even if you do, I guess it applies with grids, but it's usually would be an adjacent square. But in a free space situation, there's usually a cut-off distance at which you can strike at an enemy. And that may be different for different weapons that you have in your game. It may not be. It might be you might just have a standard melee range. And then, obviously, for ranged weapons, there is the concept of a range as well. And so the question of how far away can you be accurate? And if you're doing ranged weapons such that basically the player has to use the crosshair on the screen to aim, then obviously you still have this concept, but it's dealt with by the game system. But the further away the enemy is, the harder they become to hit, because the smaller the target they present on the screen to actually find. You may have ammo, so anything that's a projectile weapon, so guns, bows, crossbows, that sort of thing, and I guess including thrown weapons like grenades and knives and stuff. You might have a limited resource, a limited number of them, and this brings a resource aspect into the combat. Where the player may need to be managing ammo, and I'm going to put some stuff about this in another video coming up later in this series. Durability. So we're into the things that I think of as being optional potentially in your game design. So it's possible that you could have a durability setting stat for your weapon, and when the durability runs out, then the weapon's unusable, or in fact completely disappears in some games. And you may need to do things to upkeep your weapon, or just live with the fact that your weapon's going to run out and you're going to need a new one and to make one. And the way that this is done in Minecraft, for example, is that you have a durability bar on your weapon. When your weapon runs out, it disappears. And this encourages you to have to keep making new weapons. And I guess in a game where crafting is a major thing, this is a completely acceptable tactic and possibly the right thing to do. You can have damage types. So I did talk about different schools of different schools of magic in my magic series, when you might have different types in there, but you might have this for different types of weapon. And actually, physical real-world weapons you could think of as having different damage types in terms of things like piercing damage, or fire damage, or bludgeoning damage, or crushing damage. Is that the same as bludgeoning? I'm not sure. But if you then involve magic as well, you might have frost damage or arcane damage, etc. And so different weapons may have different types of damage that they're going to do, which then links in with when you're designing armor. And the design of weapons for games and armor for games have to be interlinked, but especially when you're coming down this route of having different types of damage involved. Sometimes in your games you might have a weight for your weapon, especially if you've got inventory that has limited weight capacity. So that's just a stat that practically everything that you're carrying needs. But there is another way of using weight, which is to actually use that to determine speed. So heavier weapons are slower to wield, but it may be that you can combine that potentially with a player strength stat, so that they can speed up if they can increase their strength. So the time taken to use your great big heavy sword comes down as your player gets stronger. There may be restrictions on use, so fantasy and other types of RPGs might introduce the concept of you can't use this weapon until you're level 16, or you can't use this weapon until you've got to a certain part in the world when it becomes available, or all sorts of other restrictions. You can't use this weapon until you've got a certain amount of positive faction a reputation with the particular faction that will sell you one of these. There are all sorts of ways of restricting use of weapons. You might want to restrict availability if you want rare weapons. So if you've got loot drops or random chests with random contents in, I am not advocating anybody to go in their game design down the loot box route where you pay for chests, because I'm really quite unsure about the game design and the morality of some of the aspects there. But let's move on from that. There may also be specific uses for weapons which have, often this is connected with magic, so you might have an additional use for a weapon where you can have a sword which you can wield and hit things, but it can also fire out a firebolt at the end from the end of your sword, or some other kind of way in which weapons can be used in a different way. If you want to, I'm not quite sure what kind of game you put it in, but if you've got a pistol in the game, you might give the player the ability to do a pistol whip. So all sorts of possibilities here. If you've got a money system in your game, and so you have the ability for the player to sell things to vendors or to other players, then there will probably be a concept of worth attached to a weapon. And if, even if the player can't sell, but if they can buy weapons from vendors in the world, then you're going to be needing to think about the worth and what the cost is of weapons. Okay, so that's a run through of attributes. There may be things that are specific to specific games that, in addition to that, but I think that's the most common set of attributes you might have for weapons. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is weapon sets, but actually I don't really want to talk about it because it's a more in-depth subject in some ways, so I've pushed that out to a separate video. So that will be talking about thoughts about designing not just one weapon in isolation, but how the weapons in a game fit together as choices for the player. So that's a whole lot of design thoughts about weapons in games. So, as I said at the start, you may think that some of this is really obvious. I hope some of it's been of help to you. Whatever. I'm going to say my normal thing, which is that's it from me for now.